quizzes, so weeks 4 and 5. So the the first exam will stop here. So the last question of the, as you know already, the last question of the first exam is about the Renaissance dances. So the pavane, the gaillard, and the bastons. So that's actually the last slide. This one here is the last slide for the first exam. Now, so we'll continue and we'll talk about the Protestant confrontation. So I'm pretty sure you heard about Martin Luther or these very famous figures in the history. Because in the 16th century, in the first half of the 16th century, now we have the rise of other religions aside from Catholicism. So Lutheranism was one of the first. Okay, and Martin Luther was one of the first to, I would say, rebel against the Catholic Church and criticizing it. So you have a new religion, Lutheranism. Now, the most important genre of Lutheran music is the chorale. The chorale is like a polyphonic composition. So you know what polyphonic means by now. So there are different melodies performing simultaneously. And the chorale could be based either on a new tune, so a new melody, or it could be based on a pre-existing tune. So in other words, you could have the tune that is created on the spot, or they used a melody that already existed. So all they did, they added different voices on it. This is called contrafactum, actually, because they changed the words. Sometimes these words were in secular language, not in the language of not in Latin. So they changed it and they replaced it with different words as well. There is an example here of a Lutheran chorale which you should listen to briefly. Is this one here, and you can see the text and the German and then the English translation next to it. But you should listen to it for 1 minute. So what happened is that because of the Lutheran because of different Protestant religions that were rising in Europe at that time, so we also talk about this period as the Counter Reformation, because the Counter Reformation is the reaction that the Catholic Church had, to stop the spread of Lutheran religions, basically. And so what happened is that the Pope organized a council, the so famous Council of Trent, to discuss issues pertaining to the church. So in other words, because there were a lot of things happening, and the Catholic Church was accused of corruption, so they decided to say, let's reform the church. Okay, and some of these decisions also affected music, more or less. One of which was the use of musical instruments in church, no secular tunes in church, so no secular songs in church, no church singers could be married, and then no nudity in religious art. There was also another one which was very important, which was the emphasis of clarity in the text of the music, because a lot of composers were writing music that was very difficult to understand and to perceive with the words. So the emphasis now has to be on the words, not just the music. This guy here, his name was Giovanni Pierluigi Palestrina, was a very famous composer of that time in the 16th century, and he wrote this very famous mass in honor of Pope Marcellus. He worked in the Sistine Chapel. I'm pretty sure you heard about the Sistine Chapel, very famous. And what he does, he uses what we call in music points of imitation. So what is that point of imitation? Point of imitation is basically when you have different voices that enters one after the other. So you start with one melody, then you have the same melody imitates the first melody, then the third melody imitates the first and second melody, then the fourth melody imitates the first, second, and third melody. So that's why it's called imitation, because they imitate each other. All the voices imitate each other. Now there are some examples of this, especially this one here, the last example, which if you play it, you can actually watch different melodies. Let me actually try to play it here, even though the audio is not great, but let's try.
As we reopen, don't you want
your pocket of America to still feel like its own? Here we go. Let me go back here for a second. And now, do you see how each voice enters one after the other? So that's called imitations, because they're imitating each other. Just gonna play it again for 1 second. And so on. Obviously, you can go on forever, but you know, it has to end. So let's go back here. Now, there's another important composition, which type of style of composition, which I mentioned previously in the second video, I think, if I remember correctly. So that's the madrigal. So the late madrigal becomes very important because it was cultivated all over Italy, and it was the most important genre of secular music in Italy at that time, in the late Renaissance. And this is also the period where you have I will ask you this in the second exam. This is also the period where you have the first female vocal ensemble. So very important event, because you have an ensemble, a court, which is comprised only of which is made of only of women. Okay, so women become also very important in society now, because they start to sing at court, and they become highly paid, while they still cannot perform in church, but you know, they are performing at court. The early Baroque period, I'm sure you heard about the Baroque as a term, which it actually does not come from music history, but comes from art history. So different interpretations of what the word Baroque means. Roughly is the period between 1600 and 1750 here. The term, it's, you know, some people believe it's referring to, it's a Portuguese term which refers to a pearl, but it's not necessarily true, so we don't really know what the word Baroque comes from. Now, what you have to know is actually, which will be in the second exam, is the term monody. So monody actually, it means a composition for one melody, so one individual vocal line with accompaniment with one instrument, basically. This is something that kind of during the late Renaissance, they believed that the Greeks performed monodic music because there was only one melody, which is not necessarily true. But what you have to know is that polyphony is the kind of opposite of monody, because monody you have one melody. In polyphony, you have different melodies at the same time. That's just one example. These are just some pictures of the theorbo, which is a typical instrument that they use at that time here. And then you have opera. So opera begins. That's very important. So the birth of opera. Opera is so important for later developments in music. So opera was born in Florence at the end of the 16th, early 17th century. And you have to also know the term libretto. Libretto is the plot. So if you go to, even if you go to a musical today, they give you a brochure where there's a, you know, there's a story, there's the plot, the synopsis of, that's what it is. So an opera obviously is based on a story, because an opera is a theatrical play set to music. Even though at the beginning opera was not just a play set to music, because there was a gradual development. So in other words, in Florence, by the end of the 16th century, there were a lot of families. There were some families that were supporting these musicians who composed operas. But at the beginning, operas were actually intermedi, so there were intermissions. So you did not have the entire opera which was sung throughout. It was a play that it was just spoken, and then between the acts of a play, you had these intermedi, so you had these intermissions. Okay. Then someone said, why don't we set to music the entire play? and that's what happened. So instead of just speaking in the play, they actually sang. They're actually singing. That's how our opera began. And the first operas that we have are from 1598 and 1600. But there were other operas performed earlier that we just don't have them. And there are some names. You don't have to remember the name, but you have to remember that around 1598, 1600. This is an example of the stile rappresentativo, which means dramatic style, theatrical style. You have to know. I will ask you this in the second exam. What is the theatrical dramatic style? It's very peculiar of opera. So, in other words, it's a technique. It's a vocal technique which is halfway between singing and speaking. Okay, so it's not really singing and it's not really speaking. It's halfway between the two. Okay. That's called dramatic theatrical style, but that is typical of opera. That's what makes opera sounds like opera. And then you at the same time you have all these beautiful melodies. So you have moments where the singers on the stage sang these melodious lines, right? This song, just songs on the stage with all these ornamentations, so all these beautiful ornaments, very difficult passages to sing. So, the Baroque vocal ornaments are very important. Now, you may have asked yourself, what were these opera about at the beginning? So, what were the stories of this opera? So, most of the early operas were on Greek mythology. So there were stories drawn from Greek mythology, and the most important of these stories was the myth of Orpheus or Orfeo. And you may have heard about Orpheus. It's basically a fairy tale where you have this Orpheus. He falls in love for this woman. Her name is Eurydice. Then she dies, but then he wants his Eurydice back, so he decides to go to take a journey through hell to rescue his Eurydice. Then eventually he has his Eurydice back, but then she dies again. So this was actually very, very important story that a lot of composers used to write music at that time, like especially operas, not just operas, but especially operas. And one of the first and most important setting of the Orpheus, even though it was not the first, was the Monteverdi's Orfeo, this one here. Monteverdi was a very important composer. This is important because it's the first really complete operas to include choral dances, monodies, polyphony, instrumental dances, a different kind of solo singing. So for the first time, you have everything in this opera. And there is a link here which you should definitely listen to. I'll try to play right now. Play just the introduction. It starts with the toccata. Toccata is basically the instrumental piece, just instruments, no voice, that opens the opera. So it starts the opera. Okay, there's no one singing, just the music, just the instrumental part. So let me play this part for a second. Beep. There you go.
Hey guys, my name is Danny. I'm an operations lead at Service.
Here we go. that was the instrumental introduction to the opera. Now, the last thing I want to mention today is the basic what happened is opera started as a court phenomenon. So it started a court. So very few people had access to opera because they had to be part of the court in order to listen to the operas. But now by 1637 we have the first public theater that opened in Venice. That's very important for music in general. So the first commercial kinds of music, basically, 1637, because that allowed a lot of people to buy a ticket, not a lot, but some people to buy a ticket and actually had access to an entertainment that is not a court. Did had several implications. The most important was that singers basically became the most important attraction. So actually, people could go to to an opera house to listen to singers who now were paid to perform, not just accords. The second important aspect is that composers were forced to write the music in order to accommodate and to suit the vocal abilities of the singers. The third aspect is that the liberties, so that those who were writing the stories of these operas now had to write plots that appeal the audience, not just some aristocrats. And then the fourth aspect is that the machineries and I would say technology on the stage became more advanced in the sense that the more advanced the spectacle was from a scenographic point of view, and the more people it could attract. Okay, so that's very important for music. So I will stop here today. Remember to study the for the quiz, the selections and the first exam. Okay.